The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I sat across from Richard's mahogany desk, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the grant application. $10 million. The biggest opportunity our environmental consulting firm had ever seen, and I'd already put in 60 hours of prep work on my own time. Richard, I really need some support on this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The EPA grant deadline is in 3 weeks, and if we land this, it could transform the entire company. He didn't even look up from his computer screen. Just kept clicking away at whatever online shopping he was doing during company hours. Listen, Emma, he finally said, swiveling his chair to face me with that condescending smile I'd grown to hate. You've been here, 2 years? This is way above your pay grade. Why don't you stick to the small municipal contracts and leave the big fish to people who actually know what they're doing? But I have my master's in environmental science, and I've already identified the key compliance issues they're looking for. He actually laughed. Not a chuckle, but a full belly laugh that made my cheeks burn. Emma, sweetheart, you're cute when you're ambitious. But a $10 million federal grant? You'd never succeed alone. Hell, I'm not even sure our whole team could pull it off. He leaned back in his chair. How about you go grab me a coffee instead? Make yourself useful. I left his office that day feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. But as I walked back to my cramped cubicle, something shifted inside me. The humiliation transformed into something else. Something sharper. That night, I stayed late. Really late. I wasn't just going to prove Richard wrong, I was going to make him regret every condescending word. See, here's what Richard didn't know about me. Before I came to this job, I'd spent 3 years working for a lobbying firm in D.C. I knew how government contracts really worked. I knew who made the decisions, how they made them, and more importantly, I knew how to find out things that people would prefer stayed hidden. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived and breathed that grant application. I called in favors from my old contacts. I stayed until 2 a.m. refining every section. I even reached out to Dr. Patricia Huang, my old professor who now consulted for the EPA, and convinced her to review my technical approach. But I also did something else. I started digging into Richard. Turns out, our fearless leader had a pretty interesting track record. In his previous job, he'd been quietly let go after a project went way over budget. Nothing criminal, nothing that would show up in a standard background check, but definitely something that raised questions about his competence. I also discovered he'd been padding his expense reports, nothing huge, but enough to matter. More interesting was what I found about his current pet project. Richard had been bragging about landing a $2 million contract with the state, claiming he'd personally secured it through his industry connections. Funny thing though, when I dug deeper, that contract had actually been awarded based on work done by Sarah from our water quality team. Work that Richard had somehow managed to take full credit for. The grant deadline arrived. I submitted my application at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the cutoff. It was 150 pages of the most comprehensive environmental compliance strategy I'd ever produced. I was exhausted, exhilarated, and terrified all at once. 2 months later, the call came. Ms. Rodriguez? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. This is Janet Morrison from the EPA. I'm calling to inform you that your grant application has been approved. Congratulations, this is one of the most impressive proposals we've reviewed this cycle. I hung up the phone and just sat there for a minute, staring at my computer screen. $10 million. I'd actually done it. But here's where it gets good. I didn't tell Richard right away. Instead, I scheduled a meeting with the CEO, Patricia Wells. Nice woman, actually, one of the few people in upper management who'd ever treated me like a human being. Patricia, I said, sliding the EPA approval letter across her desk. I have some news about the environmental compliance grant I applied for. Her eyes widened as she read. Emma, this is incredible. This is the largest single contract in our company's history. She looked up at me. But I thought Richard said we weren't pursuing this opportunity? That's interesting, I replied. Because when I asked Richard for support on this application, he told me I'd never succeed alone and suggested I focus on getting him coffee instead. Patricia's expression changed. He said what? Over the next 20 minutes, I laid out everything. Not just the grant success, but Richard's pattern of taking credit for other people's work, his expense report issues, and his general approach to management. I had documentation for everything: emails, expense receipts, project timelines. I wasn't making accusations, I was presenting facts. "Emma," Patricia said finally, "I need some time to review all of this. But I want you to know that this grant success, this changes everything for our company." The next week was fascinating to watch. Richard kept trying to insert himself into conversations about our big EPA win, but Patricia wasn't having it. She announced my success in the company-wide meeting and made it very clear who was responsible for landing the contract. Richard's reaction was priceless. He actually tried to claim that he'd been mentoring me behind the scenes, and that the grant was really a team effort under his leadership. Patricia shut that down fast. "Richard, according to my records, Emma requested your support on this project and you declined to provide it. In fact, you told her she'd never succeed. Is that accurate?" Watching Richard squirm as half the company stared at him was probably the most satisfying 30 seconds of my professional life. But the real comeuppance came 2 weeks later. Patricia called me into her office again. "Emma, I finished my review of the concerns you raised about Richard's management practices. We've also completed an audit of his expense reports and project attributions." She paused, and I could see she was choosing her words carefully. "Richard's employment with our company has been terminated, effective immediately. Additionally, we've discovered some irregularities that we've reported to our insurance company and potentially relevant regulatory bodies." It turns out that when you start really digging into someone's work history, patterns emerge. Richard's habit of taking credit for other people's work wasn't just limited to our company. His previous employer was very interested to learn about some projects they'd thought he'd completed independently. The best part? 3 months later, I was promoted to Director of Federal Contracts, with a 40% salary increase and my own team. The EPA grant had been such a success that we'd already been invited to apply for 2 additional federal contracts. Richard? Last I heard, he was working as a project manager for a small local firm, making about half what he used to. Turns out that when word gets around about why you were really fired, the environmental consulting world becomes a very small place. The funniest part of the whole thing was the exit interview. Patricia told me that when they asked Richard if he had any final comments, he said, "I never thought Emma would actually succeed with that grant." Even at the end, he still didn't get it. It was never about whether I could succeed. It was about what happens when you underestimate someone and treat them like garbage in the process. I still have that first EPA approval letter framed on my office wall. Not because of the money, though the $10 million was nice. But because every time I look at it, I remember that sometimes the best revenge is just being spectacularly good at your job. Oh, and I got a call last month. Richard had apparently applied for a position at one of our partner firms. They wanted a reference. I told them the truth. All of it. He didn't get the job.